Nathan and Ella, an adventurous young couple, decided to celebrate their anniversary in a quaint and secluded Airbnb cottage nestled in the Colorado Rockies. The host, an affable man named Tom, had glowing reviews, and the pictures promised a picturesque retreat away from the hustle and bustle of Denver. Upon arrival, the couple was awestruck by the beauty of the landscape, a pristine view of snow-capped mountains, vast forests, and a crystal-clear lake nearby. The cottage itself was charming and rustic, with one peculiar trait: an unusually large collection of antique mirrors adorning every room. Tom greeted them warmly, his demeanor as inviting as the cozy interior. After a brief tour, he handed them the keys with a peculiar warning: enjoy your stay, and just one small thing, try not to cover or move the mirrors, they're quite old and part of the house's charm. The first night was as magical as Nathan and Ella had hoped. They cooked dinner together, enjoyed wine by the fireplace, and eventually retreated to the master bedroom upstairs. However, the enchantment of the evening soon gave way to an unsettling feeling in the dead of night. Ella woke up to a faint whispering sound. It was difficult to pinpoint its origin as it seemed to bounce off the walls. Nathan, a heavy sleeper, was undisturbed, his breaths deep and even. Ella rose from the bed, the whisper growing clearer as she approached the hallway. The sound led her to the largest mirror in the hallway, an ornate frame with intricate carvings that seemed to writhe in the dim moonlight. Peering into the glass, Ella's reflection seemed normal at first, but as she stared, her image began to warp subtly. Her reflection's eyes blinked back at her out of sync, sending a shiver down her spine. Startled, she backed away and the image returned to normal. She decided it must be a trick of the light or her imagination. The next morning, Nathan found Ella quiet and distracted during breakfast. When he questioned her, she dismissed her experience as a result of the wine and fatigue. But as they planned their day, Nathan noticed that the mirrors seemed to subtly demand his attention. Whenever he passed by one, he could almost swear he saw something, or someone, moving just at the edge of his vision. Despite the eerie occurrences, they spent the day hiking and exploring the nearby town. Returning to the cottage as the sun set, they found the atmosphere had shifted. The once comforting isolation felt heavy, oppressive. As darkness fell, both felt an unspoken anxiety about spending another night there. Determined to keep a light mood, they played board games by the fireplace. Yet, as the night grew deeper, the air around them felt denser, chillier, even as the fire roared. The whispers returned, this time louder, and Nathan heard them too. The voices seemed to echo from the mirrors, each syllable clear, yet in a language neither could understand. Increasingly unnerved, they decided to remove the mirror in the living room, covering it with a blanket. Almost instantly, a palpable anger seemed to radiate through the room. The temperature dropped sharply, and the fire sputtered as if choked by an unseen force. Nathan and Ella recoiled as a loud crack split the air, the mirror they had covered shattered behind the blanket. Frightened but resolute, they planned to leave at first light, unwilling to endure another night. They retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind them, a meager barrier between them and the unknown. Sleep was elusive as they lay listening to the sounds of the house, the wind against the windows, the creaking of old wood, and a soft, malicious chuckling that seemed to seep through the walls. In the pitch darkness, they huddled together, whispering reassurances. Suddenly, the door handle rattled violently, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. With a loud thud, something heavy struck the door, causing both to scream. The assault stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the echo of their fright. As dawn approached, the couple felt a tentative relief, believing they had endured the worst. But as the light crept into the room, they realized the door was ajar, despite being locked and barricaded. Peering out, they saw every mirror in the house was now cracked, their frames splintered. The whispering had ceased, replaced by a silence that was somehow more terrifying. Eager to leave, they packed quickly. As they descended the stairs, the front door swung open on its own, inviting them to leave. They needed no further prompting, rushing to their car, the unsettling feeling of being watched lingering with them. As they drove away, Nathan glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the cottage recede into the distance. Instead, he saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching them leave, a figure that was distinctly not their genial host Tom, but a shadowed, indistinct form that seemed to ripple and sway as if made of smoke. Nathan's breath hitched, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Beside him, Ella had turned to look back too, her face pale as she caught sight of the figure. "Just drive," she whispered, her voice trembling. Nathan nodded, pressing harder on the accelerator as they left the cottage far behind. The road ahead was foggy, the trees lining the path seemed to close in around them, the branches forming a tunnel that obscured the sky. The drive back to Denver should have taken a couple of hours, but time seemed to stretch and distort. The same turns appeared over and over again, like a loop they couldn't escape. Nathan's eyes darted to the GPS, but it flickered and went blank. A deep sense of dread settled over them, the car's headlights barely piercing the thick fog that rolled in like a living thing. Ella turned on the radio, seeking any distraction, but the only sound was a static hum that gradually morphed into faint whispering, mirroring the eerie sounds from the cottage. She quickly turned it off, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening, Nathan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but we'll get through this," Nathan replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The landscape slowly changed, the familiar road replaced by an unkempt, gravel path that crunched under the tires. They hadn't turned off the main road, yet nothing looked familiar. The car's headlights flickered, and for a moment, darkness enveloped them. When the lights blinked back on, a figure stood in the middle of the road, causing Nathan to slam on the brakes. The figure was cloaked, its face hidden under a hood, its hands raised as if beckoning them forward. Ella screamed, grabbing Nathan's arm. "Don't stop, Nathan. Please, just keep going." Nathan swerved around the figure, glancing in the rearview mirror as he did. The figure remained in the road, watching them as they drove away, its posture eerily calm. As they continued, the temperature dropped, their breaths visible in the air. The heater in the car was on full blast but did nothing to ward off the bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into their very souls. After what felt like hours, they saw lights ahead, a small town, its dimly lit streets deserted. Nathan didn't remember any town being on the route back to Denver, but neither of them cared. They needed to stop, to get away from the oppressive feeling of the car. They pulled into the town, the streets eerily silent. The buildings looked old, worn by time and weather, their windows dark. They parked outside what looked like a diner, the only building with any light visible. The sign was flickering, half the letters burned out, but it offered a beacon of hope. "We need to find out where we are," Nathan said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. They got out of the car, the door closing with a loud thud that echoed down the empty street. As they approached the diner, they noticed that the light was coming from a single bulb swinging gently above the door. Inside, the diner was empty, the tables unoccupied, the counter dusty. A radio behind the counter played softly, the same static-filled whispering they'd heard in the car. Nathan called out, but no one answered. The place seemed abandoned, yet the coffee pot on the counter was warm, a fresh pot brewed. Ella shivered, hugging herself. "This doesn't feel right, Nathan. It feels like we're being watched." Nathan felt it too, the weight of unseen eyes upon them. He glanced around, half expecting to see the cloaked figure from the road or the shadowed form from the cottage window. But there was only the empty diner, the swinging light bulb casting more shadows than light. As they turned to leave, the door to the kitchen swung open slowly, the creak of its hinges loud in the silent diner. From the shadows behind the door, a low, guttural voice spoke, sending a shiver down their spines. "Lost are you?" the voice asked, its tone mocking. A figure stepped from the shadows, its features obscured, but its eyes, a piercing, unnatural blue, fixed on them with an intensity that rooted them to the spot. The figure moved closer, its movements smooth and deliberate. "Many are lost here, never to find their way back. What makes you think you'll be any different?" Nathan and Ella were too frightened to speak, their instincts screaming at them to run, but their bodies unwilling to cooperate. The figure chuckled, a sound as cold as the air around them. "You came to the mountains seeking escape, a little adventure. But some places," the figure continued, "are not meant to be disturbed. They hold secrets that are better left alone." The figure's gaze seemed to pierce through them, reading their deepest fears. Nathan found his voice, though it trembled. "What do you want from us?" The figure's lips curled into a smirk, its eyes never leaving theirs. "To show you what lies beyond the veil. You've glimpsed it already, with the mirrors, the figure on the road, the endless loop. Reality here bends, twists, and what you see is just the surface." Ella clutched Nathan's hand tightly, her other hand reaching out to steady herself against a diner chair. "How do we leave this place?" she asked, her voice a whisper. The figure stepped closer, its face still obscured by shadows. "Why leave so soon? You haven't seen all there is to see. The night is long, and the darkness has much to reveal." Outside, the wind began to howl, a sound that seemed almost human in its wail. The diner's lights flickered more aggressively, casting the room into brief moments of darkness. When the lights flickered back on, the figure was gone, the door to the kitchen swinging slightly as if in the wake of its departure. Nathan and Ella stood frozen for a moment, unsure if the danger had passed or if it had just begun. The eerie feeling of being watched persisted, heavier now, as if the walls themselves held breaths. "We need to get out of here," Nathan said, pulling Ella toward the diner's exit. They stepped back into the cold, the town silent around them, the darkness seeming to press in from all sides. They hurried back to their car, the sense of urgency driving them forward. As they approached, the car seemed untouched, but the atmosphere around it had changed, the air felt charged, electric. Nathan fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The car door opened with a creak, and they climbed inside, locking the doors the moment they were in. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life on the first try. Relief washed over them briefly until they realized the road they had come in on was no longer visible. In its place was just more of the thick, oppressive fog that seemed to have a life of its own. The GPS flickered back to life, its screen glitching before stabilizing. A new route appeared on the display, one that hadn't been there before. It was a road leading out of the town, a straight shot that promised to reconnect with the main highway. With no other options, Nathan put the car into gear and drove into the fog. The headlights carved a path through the mist, but the road ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty. Ella kept her eyes on the GPS, the line marking their route the only sure thing in a world that no longer made sense. The further they drove, the more the scenery began to change. The trees grew denser, taller, their branches gnarled and twisting towards the sky like desperate hands. Shadows moved just beyond the reach of the headlights, quick and darting as if the forest itself was alive. Whispers filled the car, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Nathan tried to focus on the road, but the voices grew louder, drowning out even the sound of the engine. Then, up ahead, the lights caught something in the road. A figure, standing just as before, cloaked and hooded, its face obscured. Nathan slowed the car, stopping just feet away from it. The figure raised its head, and though its face was hidden, they could feel its gaze on them, cold and calculating. "You cannot outrun your fate," it said, its voice echoing in the car, filling the space with dread. The figure stepped aside, gesturing down the road. "Go then, see for yourself what lies at the end of this path." With no other path available, Nathan drove past the figure, the road stretching out endlessly before them. The trees seemed to close in, the whispers grew to shouts, and the fog enveloped the car completely, obscuring all but a few feet of the road ahead. As they drove, the air inside the car grew colder, the shadows darker, and the line between reality and nightmare blurred until it was impossible to tell one from the other. And ahead, in the distance, the faintest glimmer of light beckoned them forward, a beacon in the darkness that promised answers or perhaps the culmination of their terror. The road seemed to stretch on interminably, the faint light ahead growing neither closer nor further away, as if suspended in the fog. The car's interior was silent save for the sound of their heavy breathing and the incessant whispers that now seemed to seep from the very fabric of the car seats. Ella clutched Nathan's arm, her eyes wide as she stared into the opaque whiteness outside. Each breath they exhaled fogged the windows, adding to the claustrophobia of the enclosed space. As they continued, the whispers morphed into discernible voices, voices that spoke their names, voices that recounted memories only Nathan and Ella knew. They spoke of hidden fears, whispered secrets, and unspoken regrets, weaving an audio tape of personal and invasive thoughts that left the couple feeling exposed and vulnerable. The trees that lined the road were now grotesquely distorted, their branches twisted into gnarled shapes that resembled hands clawing at the fog. Every so often, a face would appear pressed against the window, gone as quickly as it came, leaving only the fleeting touch of fingertips trailing down the glass. Nathan tried to focus on the driving, but the road itself seemed to be playing tricks on him. It would suddenly dip or curve without warning, the GPS signal lost completely now, leaving them navigating by instinct alone. The light that had seemed a beacon now flickered like a candle flame in the wind, taunting them with its elusive promise of escape. Ella turned on the radio again, desperate for any sound other than the haunting voices, but what came through was not music or static, but a low, droning chant that resonated with a sinister cadence. The words were unrecognizable, a language foreign and ancient, yet they seemed to pulse with an urgent malevolence that set their nerves on edge. "Turn it off!" Nathan shouted, his voice breaking as the chant seemed to grow louder, vibrating through the car's frame. Ella complied, her fingers trembling as she pressed the button, plunging the car back into oppressive silence. Just as she did, the car lurched as if struck, causing Nathan to lose control momentarily. He managed to steady it, but not before their hearts leapt into their throats. Outside, the fog began to swirl violently, as if a storm were brewing within it. Shapes moved within the mist, large, looming figures that paced alongside the car, keeping speed with them. Ella screamed as a face, horribly disfigured and screaming in silence, appeared next to her window, its mouth agape in a silent wail. Nathan swerved instinctively, nearly veering off the road. He regained control, his breath shallow and ragged. "We have to keep going," he gasped, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "We can't stop here, not now." Ella nodded, her face pale, her eyes darting frantically from window to window, watching the horrors that paraded just beyond the glass. The road seemed to narrow, forcing Nathan to slow down as the branches scratched against the car like fingers trying to claw their way in. The light ahead was now brighter, more focused, as if it were calling them toward it. As they drew closer, the fog began to thin, revealing a large, imposing gate that loomed ahead. It was wrought iron, twisted and adorned with ornate spikes that gleamed under the light, which they now saw emanated from a large, old-fashioned lantern hanging above the gate. The figures in the fog backed away as they approached the gate, their forms dissipating into the mist as if unwilling or unable to follow them further. Nathan stopped the car in front of the gate, the engine idling roughly. The lantern cast eerie shadows on the ground, and the gate itself was chained shut, a large padlock securing it. Ella reached out to touch Nathan's hand, her voice a whisper. "What do we do now?" Nathan looked at the padlock, then at the lantern, and back at the road they had traveled. "We find a way through," he said, his voice determined. "Or we find another way around. But we can't go back. We can't ever go back." The decision made, they stepped out of the car, the ground beneath their feet crunching with frost. The air was colder here, the silence deeper. They approached the gate, their movements hesitant but resolute. As they reached out to examine the lock, the lantern above flickered violently, casting dancing shadows across the iron. And from the shadows, a new voice emerged, deeper and more terrifying than the rest, booming through the stillness. "Why do you seek passage?" it bellowed, the gate itself seeming to vibrate with the power of the words. Nathan and Ella stepped back, their eyes wide. The voice continued, its tone mocking yet curious. "What lies beyond is not for the faint of heart. Do you dare to uncover what many have sought to keep hidden? Or will you flee, like all the others, back to your mundane realities, forever wondering what might have been?" The air around them grew colder, and the mist began to seep back towards them, slithering along the ground like a living thing. Nathan clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "We've come too far to turn back now," he shouted into the darkness, his voice bold despite the fear that gripped him. Ella nodded in agreement, her own voice steady as she added, "We want to go through. We need to see what's beyond. Tell us what we need to do." The booming voice laughed, a sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. "Very well," it said. "But know this, the path forward is irreversible, and what you find may not grant you the peace you seek. To open the gate, one of you must remain behind, a guardian of the threshold, forever bound to the mist." Nathan and Ella exchanged a horrified glance. The choice was cruel, unthinkable. Yet, as they considered their journey, the hauntings they'd endured, and the uncanny lure of the unknown that had driven them this far, they realized that their fates might have been sealed long before this moment. With a heavy heart, Ella stepped forward. "I'll stay," she said softly, her decision made with a mix of dread and determination. "Nathan, you must go forward. Find the truth, and maybe, in finding it, there's a way to free me." Nathan protested, his words a mix of despair and anger, but Ella quieted him with a sad smile. "It's the only way," she insisted. "One of us needs to see what's beyond, and one of us needs to make sure they can. This is my choice." Before Nathan could argue further, Ella turned to the voice in the shadows. "I am ready," she declared, her voice echoing in the silence. The ground trembled, and the chains on the gate rattled violently. Slowly, the padlock unlocked itself with a loud click, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. The gate swung open, revealing a pathway that glowed with an unnatural light, leading into realms unknown. Nathan, tears streaming down his face, embraced Ella tightly, whispering promises to find a way back for her, to undo this cruel fate. Ella held him just as tightly, her own tears mingling with his. "Go," she whispered. "Find the answers we need. And never forget." With one last look, Nathan stepped through the gate, the light enveloping him, pulling him forward. Behind him, the gate swung shut with a resounding clang, and the mist swirled around Ella, embracing her as its new guardian. The voice in the mist whispered to her now, a constant companion in her eternal vigil. "You have chosen bravely," it murmured. "Perhaps, in time, you will come to understand the true nature of sacrifice." As Nathan disappeared into the light, the scene faded to black, leaving viewers with a haunting tableau of love, sacrifice, and the unending quest for knowledge. Ella, now part of the mist, watched over the threshold, a silent sentinel bound to the secrets that lay beyond, while Nathan ventured into the unknown, carrying with him the hope of liberation and the heavy burden of their shared destiny. The story paused here, a cliffhanger that left the door open for a journey into the deeper mysteries of the universe, the nature of reality, and the power of human connection, a tale to be continued, where the boundaries of horror blur into the realms of the profound.